Next up, we would like to present Patrick Binns, who is the Canadian Consul General from the Boston office. So Patrick Binns, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of Council, ladies and gentlemen, residents of South Portland and interested parties. I am delighted to be here and to add information to this discussion about the Alberta oil sands and its relationship to American energy use. We are highly integrated, of course, in terms of energy, and I'll come to that in just a moment. My background is that I'm from Prince Edward Island, own a small farm there, and I was for a time, about 11 years, Premier of Prince Edward Island. In that time I came to Maine quite often to meet with your governors, elected representatives, and also relative to our farm. So I know we have an integrated economy. It was always interesting and a lot of fun to do business here in Maine, as it continues to be for Canadians. I would tell you that around my farm, there's a lot of blueberry land, and a lot of those blueberries, in fact, are purchased by Wyman's, a big blueberry company here in Maine, and so our berries are processed in the state of Maine. Also, if you've ever gone to Prince Edward Island, you may have gone to a campground that we go to often, called Twin Shores, and it's probably the most wonderful family campground I've ever been to, and it's owned by Mainers, and another example of that relationship between our two countries. We are certainly business partners and friends and allies for many, many years. Canada buys about, I'll put it this way, about 30% of Maine's exports actually are sold to Canada. And in turn, yes, Canada sells Maine a lot of products as well, particularly energy products. In fact, the value of energy products sold to Maine each year is about $560 million. We are very significant suppliers of electricity, of natural gas, and of oil. And much of the renewable energy that is consumed here does come from renewable hydro dams in Canada. It's quite possible that the lights in this auditorium could be generated from hydro power from Canada. Hydropower in general is a non-greenhouse gas emitting. It's safe, reliable, and by many comparisons inexpensive. Canada is also very much in the renewable energy business, and many of you would know that. Projects such as the Kiwi Wind project, which is Maine's largest wind farm, in fact, is owned by a Canadian company. And we continue to develop our renewable energy sources as you do. And we know that in Canada, we know very well that even with all of the alternatives, the energy alternatives that we have and we continue to develop as part of our energy mix, that we will continue to need oil for decades. I know I came to this meeting tonight by car, and I see the parking lots are full, and even though we continue to bring hybrids and other forms into the energy equation, we will continue to rely on oil into decades ahead. A reality for all of us is that Canada's oil sands are part of our energy future. Not just mine, but yours as well. In fact, 24% of the United States crude imports come from Canada, and most of that does come from the province of Alberta. The oil sands, part of the reason for this is that the oil sands are the third largest reserve of oil in the world, only after Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. Now, the good news about oil sands development is that, well, it's not that old. In the early days, you know, the question is, how do we get this oil out of the ground? The native people knew the oil was in the oil sands for centuries. In fact, oil will actually flow. It doesn't actually flow from the banks, but you can see the oil coming out of the banks of the Athabasca River, which flows through the middle of the Alberta oil sands. And the native people have used the oil in various ways over time, even to perhaps sealed canoes, water intrusion, and that sort of thing. So the oil sands and the environment have coexisted, not suggesting that we want oil and water, but a relationship has been there. Now let me say about technology. Technology continues to change the way the oil sands are developed. Since 1990, for example, greenhouse gas emissions from the oil sands have been reduced by 26%. And in fact, greenhouse gas emissions from the oil sands are now comparable to many heavy crude oil areas. We could use Bakersfield, California as an example of that. Greenhouse gas emissions from the oil sands are roughly comparable to that source. They're also comparable to other heavy oil production which is imported to the United States from countries, some of which are, I suppose, hostile or certainly not favorable towards America, including Canada. And a lot of that declining production will be replaced by oil from sources such as the Alberta oil sands. Now, the oil sands do account for about 6.9% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. We don't deny that it is a greenhouse gas contributor, a significant one. On a global scale, it amounts to 0.1% of global emissions. So it's not the huge emitter of greenhouse gases that some would want to suggest. In fact, if we compare greenhouse gas emissions from the oil sands to emissions from US coal, coal emissions are 40 times greater than the oil sands greenhouse gas emissions. Now, oil sands development is very highly regulated. No company can go in and start to develop an oil sands project without heavy permitting, and not all requests are given, and those that are take years in their development. Performance is reviewed. Every site that's opened up and developed must be fully restored. By that I mean the trees must be replanted, the flora and the fauna is brought back to its hopefully original state. Wildlife, I've been on sites that have been restored, and the wildlife come back. These sites are completely redeveloped. They cannot be started if they're not in fact returned to the original state over a time period. Now, open pits, you've seen open pits in the display here a moment ago. And yes, in the early days, almost all of the oil sands development was open pit mining. But that in fact is changing very rapidly because of technology. And today, what's used primarily is what they call in situ development. What happens now is that two pipes are basically drilled, or two wells are drilled. The first well is used to pipe down steam into the oil sands area. The steam releases the oil from the sand, and that's what the bitumen is. It's sand and oil together. Well, the steam releases the oil from the sand, and then the other well I talked about is used to pump the oil out. And so when that area oil has been removed, it's very easy to restore. There's no open pit mine. It's easy to put the trees and natural flora and fauna sort of, if you like, back in place. So the technology is changing very fast. The greenhouse gas issue is being dealt with, and as I pointed out, is comparable to many other heavy crude sources that are being used. Now let me just speak briefly to the issue of pipeline safety. Oil is being moved from the Alberta oil sands in a highly regulated fashion for over 30 years. And experience over that 30 years has proven that in fact these pipelines are safe and they are reliable. Not to suggest there's never been an accident. If you look at the history of oil in America, you can find thousands of spills back to the 1800s from oil developments that have taken place. And I'm not going to suggest that there would never be another spill. However, allegations that diluted bitumen are more corrosive than conventional oil have been proven to be false. There was just a study completed by an independent British consulting firm called Penn Span Integrity that determined that corrosivity is not any greater with oil sands crude than comparable heavy crudes. And of course, oil by its nature is not corrosive. What's corrosive would be water that comes with the oil or sand that would come with the oil. But of course, that is removed before the oil goes through the pipeline. Nobody's interested in transporting sand or water. Now, there's been great debate about the KXL pipeline, which would move oil from the Alberta oil sands to Texas oil refineries. Texas and those refineries in the Gulf of Mexico have a demand for oil, and the oil sands represent an opportunity, and some of that oil comes back into the U.S. for domestic supply. Well, I want to tell you that every state between Alberta and Texas has had to deal with this KXL pipeline issue. And now every state between Alberta and Texas have given approval to the KXL pipeline. The matter is still before the national government, but each state has individually dealt with the matter and approved the KXL pipeline. A pipeline that obviously moves oil from Alberta to Texas. Now I want to tell you too that Canada is every bit as committed as the United States to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We've committed to a 17% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions between 2005 and 2020. And we're about halfway there. Much of that coming from reductions of emissions from coal plants, which we're taking offline. So I want to assure you that Canada and Alberta are committed to being environmentally responsible. We will continue to implement new and better technologies. And much of that technology, in fact, is developed right here in the United States. I want to tell you too that about 70% of the outside investment in the oil sands actually comes from the United States. There are some 65 companies in New England who are suppliers to the oil sands, some of which would create jobs in this area. So in closing, I think we can be proud of the relationship that we have in the past and at present with Maine. We are your biggest customer, in fact, bigger than your next 7 biggest customers combined. About 29,000 jobs in Maine are related to exports to Canada. About 1 million of us come to visit you in Maine each year as tourists, and many to Portland, obviously. And I think there are about 60 Canadian companies here in the state of Maine employing some 6,300 people. So I'll wrap it up by saying that we are each other's best customers. We're close friends. We are America's strongest ally. We have an energy relationship that is highly integrated. And the Portland-Montreal pipeline is an example of that. This worked very well for some 70 years. So I would just ask you to take all of the facts into consideration. I appreciate your attention and trust that at the end of the day you will make an informed and proper decision. Thank you very much.
This is Jeffrey Soule Phillips reporting for Portland Public Access.